kind of looking at the structure of the Sattipattana Sutta and the structure of the Anapanasati Sutta, just in case any of you are trying to map one onto the other. And what occurred to me this afternoon was that with the four Satipattanas, with body, feelings, mind, objects of mind, you can see them, that there's two ways of looking at them and two ways of structuring them, even from a kind of practice point of view. And one way of looking at them is to see them as a mandala, so that they're there simultaneously. Every moment of experience involves our bodies, involves how we feel, involves what we sort of see and what we think. It involves how we kind of relate to our experience. So they're all there simultaneously. And you can also see it, especially in the Anapanasati Sutta, you can see each Satipatthana as a kind of subtler level of experience. You're looking more deeply, more subtly into experience. So going from body to feelings to mind to objects of mind, each one's a little deeper and a little subtler than the one before. And the Satipatthana Sutta, it's sort of the way it organizes its content is like a mandala. So it takes each of the four Satipattanas and it goes from first contact through to insight. So with body, it looks at the breath and it ends up with the arising and passing factors. Then with feelings, it looks at connection to feelings and it ends up with the arising and passing factors. So you get that trajectory from first contact to depth within each of the Satipattanas. The Anapanasati Sutta is organized that each section sort of digs a little more deeply and a little more subtly into experience. So it treats the Satipattanas as an increasingly subtle sequence of experience. And actually both of them are true. It's not that one's right or one's wrong. In a sense, all of them are there in every aspect of experience. And in a sense, looking at the impermanent nature of reality is a deeper level of seeing than trying to stay with the breath for the count of 10. So you're also looking at this sort of progressive sequence of experience. And what I want to do is sort of stick with that practice structure, the kind of the way we're approaching it through the Anapanasati Sutta. And I want to kind of sample a bit from the Satipatthana Sutta to the extent that it supports what we're kind of working with in the morning. So this afternoon, I want to just look fairly briefly, I hope, at some of the body section of the Satipatthana Sutta, and a bit more fully at the feelings section. And there's a couple of bits of that kind of deeper level of inquiry into body and into feelings that I'll come back to when the Anapanasati Sutta gets there, if that's clear. So if it's not clear, I hope it will become clear as we go. There are three different recensions of the Satipatthana Sutta. The most familiar one for most of us will be the one from the Pali Canon. That's the main one that we're working from. But that's a text in the Majjhima Nikaya. And as I said before, there's a slightly longer version in the Digha Nikaya, which builds on mainly the contemplation of the corpse practice. So if you're hungry for a more detailed treatment of the contemplation of the corpse, the Digha Nikaya version is the place to go to. Khema Jyoti's deciding not to go to the Digha Nikaya version. There's a second version, two other versions available in Chinese translation. One of them comes from the Mahasangika tradition, which actually has the Mahasangika tradition claims itself to be the oldest tradition, which might or might not be historically true. But there's a version of the the Sattipattana Sutta, available in the Chinese, that comes from the Mahasangika tradition. And there's a different version available in Chinese, translated from the Sanskrit, that comes from the Sarvastivadin tradition. You don't need to know much about the schools, but the reason that's maybe significant is that each of them is a little different, and the content that they deal with is a little different. And in the body section, the content that all three of them have in common, and therefore the content that is probably the earliest in terms of the tradition of the sutta, is the anatomical parts, the elements, and the contemplation of the corpse. And it's more the kind of, you could say, the kind of insight end of the inquiry into the body. The Majjhima Nikaya version and the Sarvastivadin version in Chinese both begin with mindfulness of breathing and follow through onto postures and activities. So those two sections are shared by two of the texts. So again, they're both early sections, but probably come later than the division into the Mahasangikas and the Theravadan traditions, for those of you who want to know your textual history. But the breath and the postures part of it, I think, are an important part of the practical working with experience. So I do want to look at each of those. The section on breathing, if you've had a look at it in the text, it's the bit that starts off, go to the forest, sit at the root of a tree, breathing in long, one knows I breathe in long, breathing out long, one knows I breathe out long, and so on. And it's exactly the same text as from the Anapanasati Sutta. So basically the Sattipattana Sutta quotes the Anapanasati Sutta, and it takes in its own body section, it takes the body part of the Anapanasati Sutta and quotes it. And one of the reasons that we do the four-stage metabhavana, mindfulness of breathing, one of the reasons that the four-stage mindfulness of breathing is so much better known through the whole Buddhist world is because it's quoted in the Sattipattana Sutta. So the Sattipattana Sutta is such an influential text that bit of the Anapanasati Sutta has become the most widely known and probably the most widely practiced. The four-stage practice gets picked up by the commentarial tradition, and it becomes a kind of central practice in the Theravadan tradition in particular. So in a way, that's the history of the four-stage mindfulness of breathing. And that bit's an explicit overlap between the two suttas, but it's the only bit of the Anapanasati Sutta that the Satipatthana Sutta quotes. But people managing to get their head around the difference between the two suttas, the Satipatthana is the kind of encyclopedic one, Anapanasati is looking at the breath and using the breath to explore the Satipatthana. So it's a much more focused text. So that's the only point that I wanted to make about the breath part of the body tradition. And then the body text in the Satipatthana Sutta goes on to postures and to activities. So if you don't mind, I'll just read it. So the postures part is, again, monks, when walking, one knows I am walking. When standing, one knows I am standing. When sitting, one knows I am sitting. When lying down, one knows I'm lying down. And one knows accordingly however one's body is disposed. Then it goes to the refrain, then it goes to the activities. And the Buddha says, again, monks, when going forward and returning, one acts clearly knowing. When looking ahead and looking away, one acts clearly knowing. and flexing and extending one's limbs, wearing one's robe, carrying one's robe and bowl, eating, drinking, tasting, defecating, urinating, walking, standing, sitting, falling asleep, waking up, talking, keeping silent, one acts clearly knowing. And then each of them followed by the refrain. So this might be an obvious question, but what is that bit of the text asking us to do? What are the implications of that? Now, I'm inclined to treat the postures and the activities as a kind of single area of attention. It's sort of how we're acting, what we're doing with our body. And this might be so obvious, all of you are sitting thinking, why is he even asking us this? But anybody want to just repeat the obvious? I think it's never a bad thing to state the obvious. What's this getting at? Naravira's looking after the crowd management.
John, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, that you should be aware and clearly knowing at all times, doing everything.
Yeah, and this might be, again, another obvious question, John, but why? Because?
That, don't know, that is such an obvious question, but that awareness is, if you really want to be aware of, you know, what's going on, what you're feeling, what your body's doing, whatever it is, then if you just do it on a kind of part-time basis, then you only get into it in a more shallow way, and then you leave big chunks out.
Yeah, you leave big chunks of your experience out, which means we leave big chunks of our habitual response to our experience out, which means some of those habits just carry on running. Any other takes on it? So just thinking about your own practice, what do you think this is asking you to do? Bandra's got, oh, sorry, I'm not doing that bit.
That's fine, Badra. Go ahead.
Well, I just think this phrase, one bides at independent, sounds very, something about one's knowing the experience, but not in some way clinging to it.
Yeah.
So there's something about simply being with it, but not in some way being unconsciously identified with it, maybe, something like that.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Badra, again, just sort of spelling out the implications of that. What would the kind of, if we start to do that, what's the consequence of that? What's the implication?
Well, the experience, the changeable nature of experience, the sense of space and ease that comes out around, kind of really recognizing that being with the felt sense, the body. So it's, yeah, I mean, I suppose for me, it's something about it creates more space around the content in some way.
Yeah, it's a very evocative phrase, isn't it? That thing about dwelling independent. And again, it's one of these phrases that we can misconstrue because it can easily sound like a kind of disconnection.
The sense is freedom. It's freedom.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a kind of freedom in relation to the experience. So it has no sense at all of a disconnect. But this whole language of very often our mind's conditioned by experience. So somebody said that our mind's like our hand trying to pick up a cup, so that the mind sort of takes the shape of the object that's engaging with. And what you're doing when you start to bring awareness in is, rather than the mind taking the shape of the object of attention, there's just this consistent openness, that's present to something, but it's not shaped by it. It's not, as it were, it's not conditioned by it. It's conditioned by this sustained attention or sustained intention to be aware, open, responsive. That becomes the consistent shape that the mind takes. Yeah. And again, but we're back to this thing that what we're looking at is we're trying to break the reflex, we're trying to break the habit of the mind always shaped by the experience that impacts us. And we're trying to create this sort of quality of awareness that's consistent. So like Badra bringing out that phrase of dwelling independent. You're independent in the sense that your capacity to be aware and present isn't determined by the experience that we're attending to. It's just there as a more and more consistent quality of awareness in our experience. And if it's not starting to flavour all those different dimensions, the very ordinary dimensions like, where is it? Looking ahead, looking away, flexing and extending one's limbs, wearing your robes, eating, drinking, eating, defecating, urinating, walking, standing, all of that, what you're looking for is, at the end of each of these lines, you've got this word clearly knowing. And the clearly knowing is the sampajanya. And the sampajanya is the sustained intention to respond out of awareness and openness. So what you're looking for is the glimpse that you get on the cushion, gradually finding its way out into more and more of our experience. You know, like the model of the Eightfold Path, I think, is another way of saying the same thing, that what starts off as a glimpse of something starts to affect how we feel emotionally in relationship to it, starts to affect our communication, starts to affect our ethical behaviour, starts to affect how we choose to earn a living. It's just that same attention to what keeps that openness in place and what breaks it. How can we sustain that quality of mindfulness that we start to touch on into a more sustained experience that permeates through more and more of our experience? And again, this thing, it's a training. It's not something that we succeed or fail at. It's something that as we stay connected to that intention, becomes more and more of a sustained experience. But a lovely image from the Tibetan experience, or the Tibetan tradition, that talks about insight as a lot of short moments often. And look, it's not that you start off with a sustained experience. You remember, then you forget, then you remember, then you forget. And again, the Tibetan tradition, it says eventually the moments start to join up. So it's a lot of short moments, often, that start to join up. And the training is just to remember to have the short moments. So that's enough on postures and activities. Any more about that aspect of it? Then you get the sort of big ones there. Oh, somebody have a hand up, Naravira, look to you for. Is it Sally? Did you want to say something? Sally, you're muted.
You might have already said it, Dhammarati, but it just seems to me that with that sustained intention and awareness, it means that anything that arises in that, which could arise in meditation or in your day-to-day practice and living your life, there's less, it's almost like a paradox. It's a very spacious awareness, but it also doesn't allow the space for something to arise and grow into something bigger. It's like you catch things more easily when they arise.
was it Sangharakshita says somewhere, if you take awareness into negative emotion, it tends to diminish it.
Yeah.
And if you take awareness into positive emotion, it tends to support it. So it sort of stops, as you catch it, it stops the polarizing emotions of craving or aversion from arising. If you catch piti or sukha or awareness arising, it tends to open the space for them to become stronger currents in experience. So you're catching negative emotion earlier and earlier in the process. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if somebody else had their hand up. I don't know if they want to also ask their question. Okay, no.
Go on, Kamini.
All right then. It's not very well formulated, but something about bringing awareness into the body and the posture and all those examples, because that's true. You know, that's something that we can kind of to some degree have certainty that it's true. Whereas if we're bringing it into mental, emotional, less tangible things, well, they're fabrications, aren't they? They're less. They're constructed by us. They're is that a question?
I think it's an interesting angle, maybe something for the discussion groups. I don't totally know the context or the kind of framework that this idea of mental events being more constructed than physical events, or feelings more constructed than physical experience. I'm not totally persuaded by it myself. I think that kind of privileges physical sensations in a way that to me is a little bit reductive, and that doesn't give feelings or spontaneous mental events or deeper seeing quite the, if I can be a bit highfalutin about it, the ontological status they deserve. I think it's a slightly reductive, slightly even materialist position sometimes, but I'm happy to leave that for the discussion groups.
Or maybe,
and I'll stay well out of it.
Or maybe even conversely, that one thinks one's bodily experiences are realer than they actually are.
Yeah. I remember sitting in on a conversation with Visantra, and Visantra works a lot with like sadhana practice and with visualization practice, and he was putting up a pretty robust defense for the archetypal Buddha forms as being as objective and as real as our physical sensations, and was very reluctant to concede that in some ways physical experience was more real than the spontaneous productions of the imagination. I think he would say that all of them are as provisional and as fundamentally insubstantial as each other.
Yes, but his where he is coming at is from the sort of elevated Visantra height, whereas most of our conceptual thinking is about, you know, what's for dinner, or, you know, is my auntie fine, or so, you know, it's that level of conceptualizing that's less reliable, isn't it?
It's maybe more provisional, yeah. And again, I'm happy to concede this. You know, like I think this is an area that you've given a lot more thought to than I have, Kamini. I'm just want to be a little cautious about any reductive element in this.
No, I take your point. I take your point, actually.
Great, thank you. That was a polite agreeing to differ.
No, not at all.
No.
At all. No.
But you know, like I think sort of one of the lovely things about Satipatthana practice and Anapanasati practice is it's just an encouragement to look more deeply, and in a way to kind of not assume that how we habitually understand or interpret our experience might not be the last word and it's starting to look in all of those dimensions of experience a little more closely and a little more deeply. And you want a framework of ideas that supports that deeper looking in all of the dimensions, I think. So in a way, this knocks on to some of the other aspects, the anatomical parts, the elements, and the corpse and decay. And actually, I don't want to say a lot about those. This is another example, I think, where the organizing structure of the Sattipattana Sutta starts to move it onto these challenges to how we usually construct our experience. So, you know, the kind of casual experience of our body is that you've got this coherent whole thing that we identify with. And what these practices, the anatomical parts, are trying to do, it uses the analogy that just as though there's a bag with an opening at both ends full of many sorts of grain, such as hill rice, red rice, beans, peas, millet, white rice, and a man with good eyes were to open it and review it thus, we're being asked to look at our body like that. So just looking inside the bag and realizing that you've got white rice, red rice, hill rice, various kinds of seeds that are mentioned. And the whole thing is a little more of a coming together of conditions than we often assume or that we often realize. All of these are doing that, but I want to come back to them later when the Sattipattana Sutta gets to Dhammas and the contemplation of Dhammas. But one point I did want to make coming out of the seminar in relationship to this. An important point Bhante makes, I think, is that, for example, in relationship to the corpse meditation, it's a traditional practice trying to counter our attachment to the body and attachment to physical sensation. And one of the points that gets made traditionally is that it's methodological, not doctrinal. So it's not saying that the body is ugly. It's just saying that to the extent we tend to attach to it, we want reflections that loosen that attachment. But one of the things Bhante goes on to say in the seminar on this is that we need to question whether bending the bamboo the other way by contemplating the foulness of the body is likely to have the desired effect in our own case. Most Western Buddhists have considerable work to do to establish the basis of healthy positivity necessary for practice. The most truly beautiful aspect of any human being is the fact that he or she is potentially at least a spiritual being. That potential is sometimes well hidden, but we cannot afford to reduce anyone to a bag of impurities if we want to appreciate that deeper beauty. So again, I think there's a question of what's methodologically helpful for us. And I think this idea that in our culture, in our particular character, contemplation of the impurities of the corpse might not be the most appropriate, most supportive practice for us to do. Certainly not one that's widely done in the order or movement. And the essence of it, I think, you can come at through reflecting on impermanence and reflecting on the elements. So the Anapanasati Sutta gets there a little later in the sequence. I want to come back to this reflection on impermanence, but I wanted just to put that caveat in about what it is most helpful to attend to. And I thought this sort of, that little phrase that attending to somebody's spiritual potential rather than reducing them to a bag of impurities might actually be a better support for a broadening awareness for many of us. Any thoughts, any comments on that?
Tricia.
It was such a relief to hear you say that, because I found that really not helpful.
Yeah.
Because what I found more helpful, what my where my work is really to see the potential for our spiritual growth and the miracle of the human psyche or nature, where, you know, so it's more helpful for me around looking at impermanence in the body and change and the energy and the dhyanas and things like that, rather than, you know, reducing it to a bag of bones. So it's been quite difficult for me to understand the preciousness of human birth. And so to go and contemplate those things is not helpful.
Yeah.
So I was such a relief to hear you say that. I feel like it really hit something for me.
Yeah, good. No, I suspect that might be true for a lot of us. And, you know, like, again, a lot of Buddhist practice is quite kind of pragmatic. And it's like, to the extent the practice supports a growth in awareness, a growth in liberation, to that extent, it's a tool to be used. If it doesn't support that experience, nothing's mandatory. There's no obligation to be engaging with it. So I hope anybody disappointed that they don't get to spend more time attending to the stages of decomposition of the corpse. You're allowed to go there should you choose to, but just with that caveat. Nobody.
Vimala Chitta.
Go.
I'm terribly disappointed. No, I was just thinking about how kind of alienated we are in this culture to the body, just full stop, so that we haven't even quite got a sense of having one, let alone knowing the process of losing it and decay and illness and death. All that's very hidden in our culture, whereas in Indian culture it's right out there and would have been very out there then. So not even just about whether or not it makes us feel positive or good, but also something about our relationship to our bodies in this culture. But I don't feel it's entirely just resolved by not going there. You know, not actually looking at the frailty of the body, or the fact the body's not what we want it to be in Western culture, or how we present it, or how we look at it, and how we. Do you see what I mean? There's something about moving towards more of an acceptance of the frailty of the body and what it really is, rather than
And if you don't mind me saying so, it also puts a bit of a different angle on that previous section of the body and its activities. So it's not just a kind of continuity of awareness, it's actually a connection to the actual lived embodied experience. So you know, before you're letting go, you're turning towards, you're entering into the experience, and you're also including the transitory, the fragility of it. And it was that Patricia was quoting the Tibetan verse earlier of that reflection on death just makes everything a little more poignant. In a way, almost the transience of it makes it all a little more beautiful. So I think there are ways of attending to that transience that are a little subtler and that might work better for us in the overall pattern of our practice. You know, thanks very much, Rita.
Frank. You need to unmute yourself, Frank.
Yeah, sorry. No, I don't feel that sort of detailed examination of the decay of a corpse is helpful to me, and certainly not when I look at other people. But now I'm sort of into my 70s, and I've always been physically quite active. It's becoming very clear to me that either I'm getting weaker, or those 25 kilogram bags of cement have suddenly doubled to 50s or something. And I'm aware of an aversion to recognizing that. And I think I'm aware that possibly there is a need to turn towards the fact that this is a body, and it is slowly decaying. And that's a really scary thing that I want to run away from. So in that sense, contemplation of decay is becoming important for me. Even though I'm only brushing very lightly on it at the moment because it is so scary, but it's there.
A real present aspect of your experience that you need to acknowledge and include.
Don't like it. But
Let's take a couple more on this, and if we can, I'm going to move on to feelings. A couple of hands still up.
Sally?
I'm aware I've already spoken once, but just to say around the attending to transience more subtly, one of the things I've found helpful is to fairly regularly look at my empty chair or my empty bed, or indeed my house, and realise I'm not going to be in it at some stage. And it's not like going through all the details of a corpse, but it does bring that awareness very close, fairly regularly, so that it's in my consciousness. And I do find that helps me.
No, if you don't mind me saying so, I kind of appreciate the comments from the discussion that, and bringing in that kind of caveat from Bhante. I think it's good that people are saying that also you don't want to minimize the attending to death and in a way the spiritual value of that. And there are meditation practices, particularly the contemplation of the elements, which we'll come on to perhaps a little later in the retreat, that do take attention there explicitly. So like, while you don't want to fetishize it, you definitely don't want to exclude it either. Just that acknowledgement of impermanence, of passing, of death is a really central strand in Buddhist practice. So I appreciate the corrective from the discussion. Can we just touch on feelings before we have a break? I just find my own place here. So we're on page 6 of the little booklet that was sent out, 6 of 14. And the text here is a lot shorter. How, monks, does one in regard to feelings abide contemplating feelings? So here, when feeling a pleasant feeling, one knows I feel a pleasant feeling. When feeling an unpleasant feeling, one knows I feel an unpleasant feeling. And when feeling a neutral feeling, one knows I feel a neutral feeling. And then there's an interesting expansion on that. So when feeling a worldly pleasant feeling, one knows I feel a worldly pleasant feeling. Feeling an unworldly pleasant feeling, one knows I feel an unworldly pleasant feeling. And feeling a worldly unpleasant feeling, sorry, my power's getting low, I better plug in. Unworldly pleasant feeling, worldly neutral feeling, unworldly neutral feeling. One knows what one is feeling. So 2 sections. Feeling pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, and then feeling worldly and unworldly, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So again, what's the practice asking us to do you think? Let's take the first bit first. What's the pleasant and unpleasant and neutral getting at? I'm just going to reorganize my power supply. How would you work with this in your own practice, do you think? Nope. Just checking, am I online? People hearing me?
Yeah.
Good.
You're fine. Yeah. Wait, John.
I certainly in the past, I haven't done it so much recently, but there was a period when I felt a lot of restlessness, when I felt bad about something. Things would come into my mind and I feel bad about them. And then I find myself jumping out of the meditation posture or kind of fidgeting. But actually, a lot of what helped me was mindfulness of vedana. That really, I kind of went for being mindful of vedana and just trying to catch myself feeling that initial unpleasant feeling and just taking the hit. And then that didn't jump me out of the meditation at that point. I could just carry on and move on to the next thing. No, I found that very useful for me.
So it was sort of going back a step from the kind of the activity of the mind to the underlying painful feeling, and as you say, taking the hit.
Yeah.
Yeah. How else would you work with this? What we're being asked to do? Interested to hear from some of the people who teach the secular mindfulness stuff, and I might be looking at you, Vimalachita. How would you work with this?
Unmute. Yeah, I think I didn't quite understand your question. How would you work with it? Well, you notice it. So I guess that you would try and notice whether your experience is pleasant or painful or neutral, which you can do in meditation or out of meditation just by checking in with your body and your emotions and your thoughts. What's the kind of feeling tone of it? And then to try and not react or notice if you're reacting, and just try and stay open to it. So, I mean, I notice with myself, if I feel something pleasant, there tends to be a grabbing onto it or a wanting more of it. If it's unpleasant, then I'm distracting myself to get away from it or pushing away. And if it's neutral, I'm bored and I'm going to look for something more juicy in my experience that's either unpleasant or pleasant to get involved with. So trying to stay more interested in the neutral as well. But that kind of, I suppose that just being open to it, noticing it, and, seeing to the extent you can, if you can just take that open kind of kind awareness to it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. Kind of like John was saying, isn't it? Like sometimes you're noticing the symptom, that you're not doing it, you're doing something else. And that's a cue to go back to the underlying simple experience behind.
And to try and just stay with, just be open to, because nearly always it's, the unpleasant isn't as bad as you think it is, or and the pleasant, once you've grasped onto it, isn't as pleasant as it was before you grabbed it. So, yeah.
Just grab my iPad there as it hit the deck. It didn't quite hit the deck. Yeah. And another aspect of this, again, stating the obvious, but in the same ways we were talking before about just plugging back into embodied feeling. I think one of the basic things here is, embodied experience of the body. It's just starting to be alert to, plugged into how we feel. Like a lot of the vitality of our lives, a lot of the vitality of the mind comes from that feelings level. And a lot of the time we're not really vividly aware of, alive to how we feel. So a very simple level of this is just starting to be connected to, responsive to, attending to what we feel as we go through our day. And then as Vimalachita was describing, as John was describing, just that, watching when disturbing emotions arise, that's the cue to go back a step and start to look at the impact of our experience before the reactions step in, and looking for a more skillful response to it. So very, very kind of sketchily, very briefly, that's maybe what this alive to pleasant, unpleasant, neutral is getting at. Worldly and unworldly. Anybody want to give a go at that? What's that trying to point us to? The Pali, by the way, if that gives you a clue, is no, actually, I'm not going to give you. I'll give you the Pali later. But basically, that the Pali literally means connected to the body or not connected to the body. So that's what the translation means. What's it getting at? Anybody want to speculate about what the two categories might mean, or what they might, how they might show up in our experience? Badra?
I'll give it a shot. I guess I'm just wondering about the imagination, coming back to the imagination. You were talking about Vasantra earlier, and this sense of not everything is on a physical level. So there's some experiences which aren't simply embodied, kind of concrete experiences, but there are, maybe vision or just playing with image, even, as a way of, I'd say that. So it's not concrete in that sense, but they definitely have a feeling tone to them.
And a feeling tone that's different from, as it were, kind of worldly. What would the difference in feeling tone be?
Well, just the source, I guess.
So partly the source.
Because, it's the feeling tone eventually is in the body. You can't feel it anywhere else but in the body. So it will come to the body, I guess. But I guess it's the origin, I would say. Maybe it's something of that.
Any other angles on it?
Vimalavadri, you had your hands up there for a sec.
Yeah, thanks. I was thinking about like the quality of contentment that's accessible when we're just, as you said earlier, Dhammarati, we're present, and we know we're present. We know we're involved in experience, and that provides a sort of satisfaction and contentment in itself. I think it's that sort of thing that, among others, I think of as being an unworldly present feeling. It's not dependent on, whether I've got a pain anywhere or not got a pain, or, whatever physical experience I've got. Is more associated with the quality of how I'm relating to experience.
I think that's an important element of it. So with Badras, it's partly the kind of the object that we're attending to, and what you're saying, Vimalavadri, is the kind of quality of response and the way we're responding to experience. one of the points that the seminar makes is that positive emotion is crucial to spiritual practice, and that in a way, if we're not having a more consistent experience of joy and a more consistent experience of empathy, it's maybe a bit of feedback to us that our practice isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. There are areas that need attention. And maybe to pick up a bit on what Vimala Vajri was saying, like probably the way I would read this is there's some positive experience that stimulates craving or stimulates aversion, or sort of pleasant experience stimulates craving, that stimulates something self-referential, and it kind of tightens the boundary between us and the world. And there's some pleasant experience that opens us up. So the kind of contentment that Vimala Vajri was talking about in the practice that we did this morning, that kind of feedback of PT is a sort of sign that your awareness is starting to move into new areas. The awareness is opening up. You're becoming a bit, kind of more available to your own deeper energies. And there's something about that process of opening, that process of a positive emotion that supports a deeper awareness, positive emotion that supports more openness. That I think is the sort of difference. That does the pleasant feeling shut us down or open us up? Does it stimulate something self-referential, or does it stimulate something that's opening us? Brahma viharas would be a great example of pleasant, unworldly experience, where you come into a relationship with a quality in somebody that you enjoy, and the response is not envy, it's mudita. Or you come into relationship with a painful experience in somebody else, and the response isn't to defend ourselves, it's to respond with care, to respond with compassion. And all of those are sort of movements of the awareness opening up, becoming more responsive. So I think probably for me the crux is, does it close us down? Does it open us up? Does it keep us on the surface? Does it allow us to go deeper? Does that make sense as a distinction? And I think one of the things that's important about that is that you can have a strong intention to go deeper. Like, I think sometimes this language of moving away from craving leaves people a bit ambivalent about strongly felt emotion and strongly felt intention. And I think to have a strong emotional drive, even an ardent emotional drive towards experience that supports opening, is an important element in practice. So that this distinction between worldly and unworldly, it's like starting to become aware of the experiences that support that unworldly pleasant experience. If we don't have an experience of pleasure, there's going to be no energy in our practice. If we don't have an experience that's unworldly pleasure, it doesn't serve the practice. It doesn't serve that process of growing awareness. Does that make, so the categories are clear? I suppose I'd just be interested again in what supports that for people. What gives you an experience of, inverted commas, unworldly pleasant experience? Where have you got access to that?
Chitta?
Yeah, I guess I'd never thought of there being such a clear distinction in the actual experience of pleasure itself, more in the reaction to the experience of pleasure. So I guess to me, sometimes ordinary pleasure, like in meditation, can start to open me up to pleasure that's more what you're saying, more unworldly. So almost like it's a sort of spectrum rather than a there's this type and there's this type sort of, and that, you know, you can be in kind of, I suppose, kind of more refined states or feeling pretty or something, and there can still be a tendency to want to grasp it, can't there? And or kind of increase it or want it, or
so
or
it's
not be
not
able
so
to
much
move on from it. Sorry,
so it's not so much the object of attention, it's the quality of of your response to some extent.
Yes, that can help it to grow anyway, from the ordinary to the less ordinary, or what have you.
Anything else? Where do people have access to this sort of current of experience? So it's something that's pleasurable, that supports an opening up.
David? Unmute yourself, David.
Classic. I'm not sure. Okay, I guess what's just come up in my mind is thinking about a positive aspect of pleasure. Is that when our likes and dislikes, our pleasant and unpleasant feelings are so self-referential, that's when we get tied up in them. But the change is taking them outside and towards others. They're not so much about ourselves. Otherwise, we do get caught in this trap of thinking, you know, that pleasant and unpleasant feelings are to be avoided at all costs, and we end up in this sort of neutral dead space. I was just trying to grapple with that idea that, you know, we do want to have these pleasant and unpleasant feelings. Some things are genuinely unpleasant and some things are genuinely pleasant. A joy of giving we would like to feel is genuinely pleasant. But if my joy of giving is all about making me feel good for giving, then, you know, it's self-referential again. It's not developing my practice.
Yeah, so
that doesn't really answer your question, but
yeah, no, great. It's a helpful point actually. So one of the marks of kind of unworldly pleasant experience is that there's another regarding aspect to it. It's moving us away from self-reference, which means attending to other, or including other, like giving. You know, there's so much more that we can say around this stuff, but I don't want to miss the segue that David's just given me. And I wanted to look at a little bit in the refrain. And in the refrain, you get this in every section. It talks about, still on page 6, in this way, in regard to feelings, one abides contemplating feelings internally, contemplating feelings externally, and contemplating feelings both internally and externally. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to give you the information here, but interestingly, the tradition, it kind of thinks, what was the Buddha getting at when he said feelings internally, or body externally, feelings externally, mind externally? But the commentarial tradition seems to agree that it means self and other, and that what you're attending to is an awareness of body, your own, and body of others, your own feeling experience, but also just this basic attitude of empathy between self and other. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to give you a little bit of seminar sort of Bhante from Living with Awareness. He says, it's usually taken to mean contemplation of the experience of others. And in this way, you cultivate a feeling of solidarity with all other forms of life. As far as I know, this sort of reflection forms no specific parts of the mindfulness of breathing as it's usually practiced, but it's the natural result of sustained practice. You realize in a very immediate way that just as you are breathing in and out, so too are other beings. The mindfulness of breathing practiced in this way provides a corrective against an alienated, one-sided approach to spiritual life. It seems a shame that this is not standard practice. So this idea of bringing in an explicit awareness, not just of our own body, our own feelings, but that being broadened out into a sensitivity, a responsiveness to other people's lived, felt experience, is an explicit part of the Sattipattana practice, even if it's not really unpacked. And this suggestion of Bhante's that that other regarding aspect of it could be an explicit aspect of the practice, I think gets picked up in the later tradition. And I don't know if everyone here will know it, but things like bodhicitta practice that include a breath-based awareness very explicitly include self and other. So I think just bringing in this, it begins internal. I think Bhante in this seminar suggests that internal, external, and internal and external is a deepening sequence again. So first of all, you're sort of learning how to be aware of your own experience. And then this reflection, as I'm breathing, all beings are breathing. As I feel, all beings feel. And then self and other, it's almost like there's a kind of an awareness that's big enough to include ourselves, to include other, to include the flow of energy between self and other. And the practice is sort of explicitly pointing in that direction. And I'm a little bit torn, right? There's a lot more in the seminar, a lot more that we could bring out, but I'm quite tempted actually to have a break for 10 minutes and then just to spend the last 15 minutes doing a little bit of reflective practice and doing a kind of Sattipattana approach to metta bhavana, where you include your own feeling experience, but then just broaden it out into empathy a little bit. So I guess I want just to check, would people be up for doing that in the last 15 minutes that we've got? Okay, well, let's have a break for 10 minutes and we'll sit again at 4. Bhadra?